the first of, I think, what are going to be many monthly seminars and talks and conversations that are going to be happening over the next few years. So that we think at Digital Jersey, we think are very important to really guide and to lead the efforts that need to be made here on the island. But to sort of lead into that, let's start somewhere else. We're all sitting comfortably. Yes. Then in the traditional line, we will begin. We're in a room that consists of one big story. And stories and storytelling is really the sort of the most fashionable thing in one corner of the internet, at least at the moment. That for the world of journalism, as Ted says, that I'm part of as well, we're constantly looking for new ways to tell stories, new ways to define narratives. And it's come to my attention that in the world of technology, in the world of innovation, in the world of economic development, story, narratives are perhaps the most important thing that we could possibly define at the beginning. And there are many ways of defining narrative. There are many ways of thinking about story. But the most popular, really, come down to a study by a man called Joseph Campbell in 1949. He came up with an idea of a thing called the hero's journey. He did this by a study of all of ancient mythology and also modern sort of adventure stories. And he found that really there was just one big story. There was one standard way of plotting out a story that was true for mythology and is true to this day for everything from sort of The Lord of the Rings to Breaking Bad, or something like that. And his hero's journey has 12 stages in it, which starts with the ordinary world, people going about their ordinary business, and then the second stage is a call to adventure, where the protagonist of the story is visited by somebody or visited by something which calls them to go on a quest. And then the third stage is they refuse that call. The fourth stage is they meet their mentor, an older, wiser person comes along and says, no, really, you really do need to do this. The fifth stage is they cross the threshold. They go somewhere. They leave their hometown. They cross the Rubicon. They travel into Mordor, whatever story it is, and they head out on that quest. And then the next stage is the one of tests and allies and enemies, where they get tested, they gather a team together, they find out who are their friends, who are their enemies. Then the seventh stage is the approach to the really bad thing, and then it goes into an ordeal, and then a reward. And then the 10th stage is the road back home, and then the 11th stage is a final challenge, and then the 12th stage is the elixir, where they bring back the thing they've gone to get, and they bring it back to their home community, and they transform their home community. And you'll have seen this, it's called the hero's journey, and you'll have seen this in pretty much every long-form narrative. In some form, in some way, the hero's journey appears in pretty much everything. And it's very common today in big movies or big long-form dramas on television, because Campbell's monomythic narrative structure is sort of taught in writing school. So you have that hero's journey. And then you also have another type of hero's journey, which is really symbolized by the book of Revelation, which is that everything goes horribly wrong, and a single person comes out and saves the world. Very simple. And everybody else waits around for that single person to come and save the world. Without that one single person, everybody suffers and goes to the figurative hell. And we see that in a lot of other books, in a lot of other narratives, specifically in the narratives of people who've read an awful lot of Ayn Rand in their youth. The Randian narrative of the Superman, the Übermensch, who drives everybody before them and conquers the world. saves the day through force and through force of will. Now, why am I talking to you about this? Well, that Randian narrative, that idea of the individual Übermensch, is really the thing that currently drives Silicon Valley. It's an idea that the entrepreneur, the single entrepreneur, usually male, single man entrepreneur, strides out into the world, forms a company and disrupts something, breaks something, gathers the treasure, becomes super rich through the force of their will, through the force of their will to power. And that anything that stands in their way is in some way standing in the way of a natural law. And this has led to all sorts of interesting things. It's led to all sorts of very interesting characters. For example, a couple of days ago, Oracle, the team Oracle won the America's Cup. And Larry Ellison, who is the founder of Oracle, the uber billionaire who paid for that yacht, beautiful yacht, he's very much of a Randian figure. He considers himself to be an Übermensch who has strode onto the world stage and conquered all in front of him. And he's built a house in the shape of a Japanese temple because he thinks he's a samurai. It's a bit weird. And Steve Jobs was very much of a similar nature, a man of singular, super confident vision. And because he was generally correct, it's celebrated. But it's also generally understood that he wasn't a particularly nice person. Because he was subscribed to that Randian Book of Revelations, Savior, Messiah figure narrative. And we have a man at the moment called Peter Thiel, he was the co-founder of PayPal, made himself a considerable amount of money, and he is a full-on Randian libertarian. He wants to foster the idea that everybody is for themselves, and there should be no government support and no laws or anything like that. And so he is currently trying to get permission, ironically enough, trying to get permission to build his own floating city on which similarly entrepreneurial-minded people will be able to live just offshore of San Francisco in a situation where there are no laws whatsoever, no restrictions on their freedoms, and that they can fulfill their destiny as super powerful Ubermen. He, again, is also a bit weird. And they have, through their rewriting of the history of Silicon Valley, they have created this myth that entrepreneurialism, and specifically technological entrepreneurialism, is all about the great men of history. All about these singular individuals who have formed companies and driven all before them. And this has led to the nature of Silicon Valley as it is today. Not a very nice place, actually. And it's not a very nice place because that myth of the individual hero coming along and forming the technological revolution just isn't true. One of the things that's not really understood by the rest of the world about Silicon Valley, and also about the Israeli tech sector as well, the two most successful tech clusters in the world, is that they were not created by individuals, by individual supermen, by individual entrepreneurs standing out alone on the field of battle. Instead, they were created as part of a communal effort. And a communal effort against a much larger foe. Silicon Valley is a very good example of this. In the 60s, Silicon Valley was apricot fields and citrus groves. There was nothing there. It was very cheap land. There was a couple of universities nearby, and the Cold War was beginning to get a little bit hot. And the American government said, we need to win the Cold War. We need to win this battle against the Russians. And so how are we going to do this? Well, we're going to do this by out-innovating them, by having much better weaponry. And we're going to do it in two ways. We're going to have nuclear weapons and we're going to put a man on the moon. And so in the early 60s, Kennedy made that famous speech where he said we would put a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth by the end of the decade. And we will do these things, this thing and all the others, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. The famous speech. And it kicked off a whole industry. An industry that was paid for by the American state. The first 20 or 30 years of Silicon Valley were massively subsidized. It was American military and space money flowing into that area, creating these engineering companies, and only then, and with that, creating the internet and so on, and only then, in the recent past, has there been enough of a layer of stuff onto which these people can create their own companies and their own myth that they did it all by themselves. So that's Silicon Valley, but we'll come back to that. Let's take a step back and think about Jersey for a second. Let's think about today's situation. I've spent a lot of time talking to people around the island and over the past 9 months or so, and the same phrase is used by many, many people. The phrase is managed decline. Everybody you speak to, every headline you read in pretty much every one of those business magazines that you find in the hotels, front page of the Jersey Post, Evening Post, and so on, talks about the managed decline of the economy, about the slow descent, about the falling standard of living, about the shrinking economy, about all of those things, about the shrinking financial sector. And we know the figures, okay? You know, it's down 4% last year, down 20% since 2008. The new figures are coming out next week. We can take a guess in the bar later about what those figures will be. But the picture doesn't look good. And if you were to try and turn this into a narrative, if you were trying to make this into a story, you would probably give it an apocalyptic sort of doom scenario. Or many people do. Now, doom scenarios are very popular, right? We really like doom scenarios. Popular culture really enjoys a good apocalypse. In many ways, I think we kind of yearn for the end of the world. In Western culture, we sort of really want it to happen. It's why there are so many zombie movies every time the economy takes a dip. Why so many post-apocalyptic TV series have come out recently. Because we yearn for an apocalypse, we yearn for the end of the world so that we can start again fresh. So that we can be forgiven our past sins and begin again. It's almost a religious thing. And of course, yes, there are many people who are violently opposed to this point of view, who are violently opposed to the idea that the financial services sector on the island is about to go away. That they're violently opposed to the idea that there's a problem at all. But I would say that those denialists, for want of a better phrase, are actually the strongest believers of them all. In the same way that all Satanists are incredibly devout Christians, because you have to be, to believe the absolute opposite, the people who say that there isn't a problem at all actually believe there is. It's the people who don't care in either way who really don't believe it. So we find ourselves in a really interesting situation that the island is, as the title of the talk is probably on the brink of a massive financial collapse. And if not a financial collapse in terms of the figures, because sure, there's lots of other people's money that will continue to flow through other people's companies. but in a collapse of the standard of living and a collapse of the actual money moving around the economy. So we need to do something about this. And that's why Digital Jersey was formed, and why there are all these other efforts with other industry sectors to try and do something about the fact that 40% of the economy is about to leave. So what can we do? Well, many people are doing the same thing. Pretty much every town you go to in Europe has some form of creative quarter, for example. Pretty much every medium-sized city in Europe has declared itself the digital capital of their region. And they do it all in the same way. They do it in the way of a cargo cult. I don't know if you know what a cargo cult is. There's an island, a place called Vanuatu, which is in the South Pacific. It's a very small island, much smaller than, well, it's bigger than Jersey, but it has 50,000 people on it. And there's a religion there called, well, a religion there that doesn't really have a name, but they worship a man called John Frum. And John Frum is the guy who brings them stuff out of the sky. And they, every year, have a ceremony where they summon John Frum to bring them stuff out of the sky. The stuff that comes out of the sky they call cargo. And the way they summon John Frum is they build a big tower out of bamboo. And they climb to the top of the tower, and then they have a man stand there with 2 coconut shells, one on either side of his head, and 2 flags. And the man waves the flags like this. And eventually, one day, hopefully, John Frum will return from the sky and bring them their cargo. This is a cargo cult, as it's called, because nobody really knows for sure, but we believe it was because in 1941 the Americans put in a small landing strip and landed a couple of planes and brought cargo. And there was a guy in a tower waving the planes in. And whether his name was John Frum or not, nobody knows. Nobody's able to find out. But over the past 70 years, 60, 70 years, the islanders have been repeating that action. They've been repeating that rite, attempting to bring the plane of cargo in. And when you go to these other towns across Europe or America, or even Africa now, you see the same thing but for technology. So the first thing they do is they go to San Francisco and they look around and they say, what is it that defines a technological quarter? And they say, we really need coffee shops. And so these towns put in some beautiful coffee shops. And then sometimes companies do this. So a company wanting to innovate, the first thing they do is they'll probably throw a lot of desks out and buy some beanbags or some football tables. Because they've seen that in pictures of Google's offices. It's cargo cult thinking. If you're trying to emulate what happened in Silicon Valley by repeating what is happening in Silicon Valley, you're not emulating them. You're just starting a cargo cult. So instead, we have to think, instead of concentrating like Shoreditch, for example, or many other places around Europe, instead of concentrating on the coffee shops and concentrating on the cargo cult nature of a technological revolution, we have to think instead about the fundamental nature of how to start a new industry. And that doesn't involve the hero narrative, and it doesn't involve the cargo cult. Instead, it involves an understanding that these things are communal projects, and that they require a whole new level of ambition than got people into the problem in the first place. In 1960, the start of the Silicon Valley was because of Kennedy announcing a moonshot. This island, as a whole, needs a new moonshot. But it can't be going to the moon, because they did that 60 years ago. Because otherwise we're faced with an emergency, not actually of a sudden apocalyptic death, sudden apocalyptic change, but of a slow, boring, dull decline. Sort of a mediocre fizzling out. And that realization that unless we do something extraordinary, we'll just become boring, is a very hard one for technology entrepreneurs of the San Francisco mold to accept. Because it doesn't have the heroic, I'm fighting against the enemy. They're fighting against dullness. Instead, it requires a form of faith and a form of community. As I said, I was a journalist, and I've been a journalist for on and off for maybe the past 15 years, and I was a war correspondent for quite a few years. And I was in Afghanistan and Iran and all sorts of places, the Philippines and Burma and Lebanon. And before I was a war correspondent, it had been a mystery to me how you become a war correspondent. I couldn't quite work it out. Nobody seemed to get promoted to be a war correspondent. There were never any job adverts to be a war correspondent. Nothing ever appeared on the internal email at the Times or the Guardian where I've been working that said, you know, hey, do you want to go to a war? Nothing ever happened like that. I couldn't work it out how it came about. And one of my sub-editors, a fabulous woman, she had been a war correspondent in Bosnia, and so I said to her, her name was Ivan, I said, Ivan, can you tell me how you become a war correspondent? And she said, well, I'll tell you what, take me out for a drink this evening, and I'll tell you the secret. So we went to this journalist's bar, actually just off Fleet Street in London, and I bought her her customary whiskey. And she said, so you really want to know the secret of how to be a war correspondent? I was like, yes. Buy me another whiskey. We drank our second whiskeys. So you really want to know the secret of being a war correspondent? Yes, it's all I've ever wanted to do since I was 18 and saw that film and all this. Buy me another whiskey, she says. 4 or 5 whiskeys down the line, she leans over and she says, I will tell you the secret of how to be a war correspondent. Lean in, she says. You want to be a war correspondent? Go to a war and correspond. And she had a really good point. There are certain things that you do, that you become them after you've done them. That you can't ever wait for somebody to invite you to do them. Nobody in journalism ever gets asked to go to a war. Not the first time. The first time you have to go and you correspond. And the next day you're a war correspondent. And people then ask you afterwards to do it again and again. Her point was that we can redefine our own realities by just doing the thing. A month later, I was in Afghanistan. The Afghan war was followed by the Iraq war. I never went to Iraq. I promised my partner at the time that I wouldn't go because it was far too dangerous. And one of the reasons it was dangerous was because nobody really had an idea of what was happening there. If you remember back, there was a guy called Karl Rove. He was George W. Bush's sort of political advisor, right-hand man. Sort of reformed the Republican Party. It got them elected, really. And he famously gave a quote to a reporter where he said, you guys, problem with you guys is you're in the reality-based community. And that's not the way the world really works anymore. Jersey as an island is already in the unreal reality industry. On the basis that the majority of the income of the island comes via bits that come over a wire to fill up a column in a spreadsheet. It's not as if the boat arriving comes on with lots of bullion, sacks of coins as people deposit their money here. It's already an unreal reality. It's already a figment of imagination anyway. So by rights, everybody should be quite used to defining their own reality. So instead, we now have to define what the new reality should be. I was on BBC Jersey this morning, and it was a bit early, and nobody had had really that much coffee. They were very perky, I have to say. But one of the questions that the reporter, the presenter asked me was, he said, yeah, this internet thing, right? Don't we know all about that already? You know, we do some shopping and people use Google, like it's done, isn't it? It's finished. We've done it. And here is the opportunity. The opportunity for the island, the opportunity for the tech industry, the opportunity for everybody in this room and everybody who should be in this room, is to redefine the reality of the technology industry here on the island to one of almost unbearably fast change. This is a very small place, a very tight-knit community with lots and lots of advantages. And the amount of development that could happen here should, on a daily basis, be freaking everybody out. Walking down the street, it should, instead of appearing to be 1978, it should appear to be 2078. I mean, admittedly, when it's, 7 o'clock in the evening in Jersey, it's 1962 in Guernsey, but that's not a good comparison, And the reason that we can do this, the reason that we can redefine our realities and become an unbearably fast-changing, hyper-technological place, is the very reason that Ted can put a potato into space. Although he thinks he's been set up by the FT, what he hasn't realized is what he's been asked to do by a misquote is eminently possible. Everything pretty much is possible these days. I looked into it, putting a potato into space. We can do it. If we haven't got the technology here, we can design it here. We can have the thing that holds the potato 3D printed in one of the many 3D printing factories. We can have it. We can get a nanosat box, which we can order off the internet. That can arrive via FedEx. We can assemble the thing. We can send it off to one of the nanosat launching companies, and we could have it in space in 6 months. Not only we could do that, 10-year-olds could do that. In fact, 10-year-olds already have, not with potatoes, with cress, peanuts. These things are eminently possible. And as technologists, we shouldn't be thinking about how we make web companies or gaming companies or something like that. We shouldn't be emulating the Silicon Valley of 4 years ago. We should be aiming to be the completely freaky Silicon Valley of 10 years' time. Which means launching a potato into space should be the thing that happens before Christmas. And then we move on from there. And every day, people should wake up and read the paper and go, what the hell are they doing now? Well, in the other way. in my pocket, on the back of an iPhone, I don't know if you've ever looked on the back of an iPhone, but on the back of an iPhone it says designed by Apple in California. It now says, it also now says assembled in China. I don't think it says that on the older ones. But on all Apple products, it says designed by Apple in California. They don't make these things. They don't have factories. Factories are all in China. They're all Foxconn and all those people. But they're designed in California. There needs to be, and there needs to be very soon, a designed in Jersey label. An idea from Jersey label. And instead of us trying to work out how we can get JavaScript coders to move here so we can build slightly rubbish, advertising campaigns for deodorant, we should be working how we can put potatoes on the moon or map the bottom of the ocean or genetically engineer more wine for people 10 miles over there. Or create entire new futures. And instead of replicating London or Berlin or Copenhagen or San Francisco, we should be trying to work out how to leapfrog them. The ideas are the most important thing. The execution can be ordered from somewhere else. You'll never be able to compete with manufacturing. You'll never be able to compete with mediocre work because other people can do that for basically nothing somewhere else. Graphic design can be done in India by the 100,000 top flight graphic design graduates who graduate every year, and they charge 3 pence an hour, and you can get it done instantly overnight. So instead of trying to make stuff and trying to become a middle ground, Jersey needs to step back and think, how do we just go straight to the moon? We should, instead of looking at basic gaming and advertising and marketing technologies, even fintech, we should be looking at genetics and space, biotech. And the fact that nobody here does that right now is irrelevant. Because we can learn in the same way as if I said go and learn a new programming language, half the people in this room and the employees of the other half would go, fine, give me a weekend. Well, let's stop thinking about Digital Jersey as taking the old tech. Let's think about Digital Jersey as inventing the new stuff. And if we can't do that, if we can't do completely new technology, if we can't have new ideas and develop new industries that everybody else in the world looks at with awe, then we have to take the current existing technologies we do and do them with a set of values that nobody else has. One of the reasons that the financial industry is about to disappear is because a good deal of the other countries, big countries, the G8 and so on, are looking at these interestingly taxable territories and saying, you know what, that's not cool anymore. That the values that are embodied in those laws are not values that we hold. And so perhaps it's time to reassess that reality as well. And perhaps it's time to have a look at the other things, the other values, the other laws that rule the technology world and see if we support them too. What would happen, for example, if Jersey decided that any company on the island was no longer restricted by any form of patent law or copyright? What happens if we just abolished intellectual property overnight? Probably get invaded, but worth a thought. What happens if we became a free speech haven? Julian Assange is looking for a nice place to live. Bring him on in. We're already pissing people off. You might as well do it properly, you know what I mean? But Campbell's journey, Campbell's mythical journey, ends with this final stage, the return with the elixir. And that elixir, the idea in Campbell's mythical journey is that Elixir heals the community that the hero came from. And that's something that's absolutely not happening in San Francisco or Shoreditch or Berlin or any of the other tech clusters. There is massive amounts of inequality. Tech City, Shoreditch and London, big internet startup cluster, but it's also the poorest area in London, and the spillover, approximately zero. Very much in the same way as it is here in Jersey. Great inequality. So when we're thinking about what new industries to start, what new ideas to take and run with, we need to remember that these sorts of developments come not from the individual Ubermensch leading forward and making a load of money for themselves, but instead come supported by the whole community. So the ideas need to address not just falling away of one part of the economy, but also need to address the inequality and the education levels here, and the cultural isolation, perhaps the over-historicism of the island as well, and the fact that the last 5 people I've talked to about this talk, every single one of them has said, you know, the best way you can do it, make a joke about Guernsey. Who cares about Guernsey? Why aren't we taking on Manhattan? Or Tokyo? Or San Francisco? Silicon Valley, for all of its douchiness, has internalized this idea that 3 people in a garage can change the world. 2 people in the case of Hewlett-Packard. And here on Jersey, we need to do the same thing. We need to internalize the idea that everybody in this room can go away and this weekend come up with an idea that will completely change the world, and we can meet again next week and work out how to do it and do it. Digital Jersey, however, the organization of which I'm on the board, we're not the hero in this piece. There's been an awful lot of criticism recently about this that have come from people who seem to have the idea that Digital Jersey's role is that we're like the tooth fairy. The organization will pop up and there'll be a meeting like this, and then tomorrow you'll wake up and everybody will have a new iPhone, and lots of money will suddenly have arrived under the pillow. But that cannot be. That sort of hero narrative has never ever worked. Instead, it has to be created by the whole community deciding at one moment that they're going to go for the moon. And not wait for leadership, but to create leadership themselves. To make that decision, for everybody to make that decision within themselves that this is it, this is the beginning. Time is now. And instead of working out how we're going to start some more web companies, working out how we're going to put a potato on Mars. So stretching the mission every time. The wealth of this island, the financial services sector, has been directly controlled by the whims of the chairman of the Monetary Policy Committee in London. Interest rates go up, everybody makes more money. Interest rates go down, people make less money. Interest rates stay where they are. Everybody knows you're going to not make much money. Single guy has been controlling the majority of the economy. It's time instead to retell that narrative. It's time instead to define the future of the island. Not just of the island, but of the world. By deciding on whole new technologies and then going and building them. Choosing your war and then going and corresponding. The time to do that isn't when the business plan comes out. The time to do that isn't after the election next year. The time to do that isn't after we've had another consultation or after you've written another snippy email to the paper. The time to do that is this evening. The time to do that is to, after we've finished here, we go upstairs and have a couple of beers, and we go, let's cure cancer, stick a potato on Mars, or conquer the oceans, let's build Stingray. Whatever it is, decide what the big, scary, impossible project is, and tell everybody else. Then have the weekend off, and on Monday we start. If you're waiting for the digital Jersey tooth fairy to come along and put some money into the economy, you're going to be waiting forever. But the people in this room, the people who've decided to be here at 6 o'clock in the evening on a Friday when they should be in the pub, are the people who are going to define the future of this island. And you have to choose between a slow and painful and boring death or heading to the moon in a blaze of glory. If anybody wants to go to the moon, I'll go with you. Thank you very much.